Good evening, everyone. My name is Jarrell Blakely, and I have the pleasure of serving as the Director of Government, Community, and Racial and Social Justice for the Indiana State Teachers Association. It is my esteemed honor to welcome you on behalf of the Indiana Educational Equity Coalition. The Indiana Educational Coalition is steadfast in its commitment to ensuring equitable education for every student in Indiana, and we relentlessly advocate for policies that address and rectify systemic inequities in our education system. Tonight, we convene for a critically important webinar specifically focused on the dual issues of third grade student literacy and the retention of students in this pivotal grade. The literacy levels at third grade are a significant milestone in a child's educational journey, impacting their academic development and future success. Equally critical is the discussion around the retention of third graders who do not meet these literacy standards, as determined by the I-Read 3 exam. These are not just policy issues, they are deeply connected to the lives and futures of our children. We are particularly fortunate this evening as the text of the pertinent bill was released just this afternoon, providing us with the most current and relevant information to guide today's conversation. This fresh perspective will undoubtedly enrich our discussion. To delve into these critical topics, we have an esteemed panel of educational experts, Dr. Hardy Murphy, who will serve as today's moderator, Nancy Meyer-Brown, Dr. Kymyona Burk, and Dr. Gwendolyn Lavert. Each brings invaluable insights and solutions to the forefront of this conversation. After the panel, we will open the floor for a question and answer session, inviting you to engage with our panelists. This interaction is vital as we navigate these complex issues together. Thank you again for joining us tonight for this significant conversation. Your participation is key as we work collaboratively to shape a more equitable and successful future for education in the Hoosier State.
I'm sorry, go ahead, Gerald.
I am very delighted to introduce our esteemed panelists, each bringing a wealth of experience and expertise to our conversation today. First, we have tonight's panel moderator, Dr. Hardy Murphy, currently serving in a dual role with the IUPUI School of Education and the Center on Education and Lifelong Learning. Dr. Murphy is a vanguard in the field of education, focusing on culturally responsive practices, disparities in discipline, and educational equity. His rich experience, including 13 years as superintendent in Evanston and 20 years with the Fort Worth Independent School District in Texas, underpins his impactful research in teaching and educational leadership. Also joining us is Dr. Kymyona Burk, a senior policy fellow at Excel in Ed. Her work is pivotal in shaping K-8 reading policies nationwide. Her career is marked by significant roles, including leading instructional programming in the Jackson Public School District and serving as the state literacy director in Mississippi. Her hands-on experience as a reading teacher enriches her policy work, making her a true advocate for literacy. We are also privileged to have Dr. Gwendolyn Lavert, an internationally recognized literacy specialist with a career that spans various educational roles, from an elementary principal to an assistant professor specializing in early literacy. Dr. Lavert's journey reflects her dedication to nurturing young minds. Her works as a children's author and curriculum director exemplifies her commitment to educational excellence and innovative teaching. And finally, we welcome Nancy Meyer-Brown, a veteran educator with a rich background in teaching and administration. Currently, Ms. Meyer-Brown instructs graduate students in educational leadership and literacy education at Marian University. Her work at the Perry Township School District as a literacy coordinator and her efforts in designing literacy tools showcase her dedication to improving education. A National School of Education Excellence Award recipient, Nancy's interest in cognitive skill development and brain-based education positions her as a thought leader in engaging and supporting struggling students. Without further ado, I pass the baton to Dr. Murphy to kick off today's panel discussion.
Thanks, Gerald. And one last housekeeping matter here. We have a set of prepared questions. We're going to treat this as a discussion. If there are others in the audience who would like to ask questions, have things that are clarified and responded to, I believe there's a mechanism for them to push those ideas forward, either through the chat, or is there another mechanism, Jarrell?
It's the chat.
Got it. Okay, so that works. Did we actually introduce Keith?
Oh, and we do have President Keith Gamble of the Indiana State Teachers Association. He is with us as well. We really appreciate the support that ISTA provides to the coalition. And thank you so much for joining us, President.
Off the cuff, Keith, is there anything you would like to say to address the group before we get started?
I'd just like to thank everyone for being here, and certainly to our panelists on this important discussion this evening. Former Superintendent of Public Instruction, Glenda Ritz, always reminded everyone that every test is first a test of reading. And we will continue to advocate for making sure that our students are able to read on grade level, but we need to ensure that it is done in a fair and equitable manner. And so I'm encouraged by this evening's turnout, and for our panelists, thank you all again for being here and all that you do.
So, and one last thing, Jarrell, I'm going to do this because I've been in your shoes, and I know that I could not have done anything without the person that I turned to make sure all the I's were dotted and the T's were crossed. And I don't need to mention the name. I think you know what that name is. It starts
Diana.
Starts with a D, and the Lex name starts with a C. Diana Crump. So all of you folks who are here tonight, Diana is the reason that this is organized, and everything is working so far. That is fantastic. So thank you. So as we move into this first question, there is kind of an umbrella concept here, and that is the idea that our state legislature in Indiana is contemplating a bill to improve early childhood literacy up through third grade with a law that moves towards mandatory retention in the third grade. We know that the basis of this is that some students are not demonstrating the literacy skills that we know are necessary to move into the fourth grade. The brainstorm here, of course, was the fact that across the country, there are several states that have implemented a mandatory retention program in the third grade for students who do not pass an exam to demonstrate mastery and preparation for the fourth grade. Mississippi seems to be a state that has gotten a great deal of publicity. For some, it's notoriety, and for others, it's an acknowledgement that things are changing there. We then decided that what we might do is have this facilitated conversation to talk about these issues. And so we have Dr. Kymyona Burk, who I don't know the exact title. I do know that she was the chief implementer of this new reading literacy initiative in Mississippi, to come and discuss with us and other literacy experts. And so that's who we have before us discussing this topic with our audience. And so we'll jump right into it. I'm going to bracket this conversation and start it out with one basic question that has two parts. In the ideal world, what would be the most desirable way for students to achieve preschool and early literacy readiness that leads to reading success in the early grades and beyond? That's the first half of it, of what it takes for students to become literate students as they learn to read and then transition to reading to learn. The second part of the question is, if we know what it is that has to happen for students from an instructional standpoint, why can't this happen without retention? I am going to start with Dr. Burk, since she is the guest, and what's happening in Mississippi seems to be what's of interest to everyone at this point in time. Dr. Burk, would you like to start us off with your response?
Hi, good evening, everyone. Thank you again for the opportunity to join this esteemed panel to discuss literacy. Initially, Jarrell mentioned what we are thinking, like this is really the key to quality of life. Students who are struggling readers as children become adults who are struggling readers if we do not intervene. So to address your question about the desirable way to for students to gain those literacy skills, I'll first say access and opportunities. Opportunities for children to be able to attend preschools, also that are high quality, that focus on not just literacy, but other skills that students need in order to become successful, to be able to talk with their classmates and discuss and problem solve and all of those other things. But of course, we know it starts at home with oral language, with being able to, families talking to their children, being able to engage in those conversations and discussions, because reading itself is not natural, talking is. So we have to be very intentional about how we use the code to teach children how to read. So that's the desirable state, that we would have more conversations at home leading into the student beginning school. And as they begin school, that we would have this intentional focus on teaching them how to break the code of learning how to read.
So would one of the other panelists like to respond to that? I would have a follow-up, and but I'll let you think about it, Dr. Burk. Is that you talked about what needed to happen for students in order for them to become literate learners. You mentioned some things about what should happen at home. So the question then I would follow up with was, is the Mississippi initiative to make up for what is not happening at home? But I don't want you to answer that right now. Why don't we come back around to that question, and we'll go next with Dr. Meyer-Brown.
Thank you very much. I appreciate being here this evening with everybody and all of you to share some thoughts. One of the things that I was thinking as Dr. Burk was talking was about the abundant amounts of purposeful reading, writing, and speaking that would occur in the classroom. So I went from being at the home, and I certainly concur about preschool, kindergarten, and those kinds of things right into the classroom. So what does a classroom look like? Are we focused, and do we have the systems in place in order for the child to, in fact, move from point A to point B? Have we done everything where organization and relationships are concerned? Do we have the allocation of time? And again, are the resources and people available for the children, so that in our big magic world that we have, so that they can succeed and do their very, very best. One of the other things when I go out and about and watch people teach is the level of engagement in the classroom, as well as going to your point, Dr. Burk, about explicit and intentional instruction. So if you were to say to me what types of things I think might be missing, it would be maybe to capitalize on coming in with some professional development, to take a look at what we might want to do, the allocation of resources which may or may not be in place in most of our schools for students to be successful, which would hinder their ability to read at the end of third grade. Are just two things that I mean, I've got more, but I'll be quiet for right now.
Well, thanks. Dr. Lavert, would you like to weigh in?
I would. Well, number one, I think the multicultural, especially for African American children, and we find that retention, the research is showing that they're disproportionately not fared well when we think about retention. So I think about the Africana framework, which starts off with who am I? So bringing in the types of literature that's going to help children, not just African American children, but all children know who they are and how they fit into this world. And then we talked about a little bit, I heard about rewiring the brain, that the brain is not meant for reading, and how do we rewire the brain? Well, many parents don't know about this. And so as a principal, it was very important for me to bring parents into the school to be trained. And what does that look like when we talk about rewiring the brain? And also letting them see and hear about the opportunity myth, which is a documentation of what's happening in classrooms.
Okey-doke. I said I was coming back, Dr. Burk. Now here's the hot button issue. From the standpoint of an educator, I've not heard of any strategy that our literacy experts have mentioned, nor you, except for the preschool experiences at home that require retention to be implemented. So, of course, that is the hot button issue. If we know what is the best ways to develop literate learners, why are we retaining students to make sure that happens?
Well, knowing what to do and doing those things are completely different, right? So there's this thing called implementation science, and it's where we close the gap between what we know and what we do. We've talked about equity. Dr. Lavert actually mentioned, our subgroup of African American students. I think we all have spoken about access and what things are happening in schools. There are some great things happening in some schools. The problem is that there aren't great things happening in every school. And we know that as fact, right? We do know that. And in some cases, it's not that the teachers, of course, don't want to do it. It's just the teachers may not know how. So when Nancy mentioned the professional development, when Dr. Lavert mentioned how she talks to parents and informs parents of the things that need to be done with children, I think that sometimes we take for granted and we think because we're in academia that we just know what to do, that everyone knows. But we have to invest in building capacity. So when you say that we haven't talked about any strategies that require retention, I don't think that there are strategies that require retention. I just think that we have to start earlier in doing the things that we know will prepare kids to become skilled readers. And in some cases, all of the things that we've mentioned have been barriers. They've been barriers to opportunities for kids. They've been barriers for access. And again, lack of resources can be one. I don't think anything is intentional. I don't think that, we get in this work because we don't want kids to succeed. We all want kids to succeed. And in some cases, our resources, our access, our opportunities hinder us from doing that. So when we think about a policy, any policy really, or a policy specifically to improve reading outcomes, I definitely don't want to start this conversation talking about retention, because retention is the last resort. Retention should be used as an intervention strategy for those students who we've done all of these things already. And by the time the student is in third grade, then their deficits haven't been remediated. That's who retention is for. It's not for every kid. It's for, all of these other supports that I'm sure we'll talk about tonight, that's supposed to start in kindergarten or at home, or, I really want to focus on what we should be doing, not what happens if, but what we really proactively should be doing. So by the time we get to third grade, we aren't retaining kids. So, I agree with you. There's no strategy that will require us to retain kids. The strategies are what we should do to prevent kids from being retained. And it's not just being retained, to prevent kids from not being able to access language or media or reading or those types of things.
Thanks. So in truth in lending and full transparency, I've been an outside evaluator and a key advisor for the National Implementation Research Network, Dean Fixon's group, headed up by Karen Ward, now out of University of North Carolina. So I've been researching, advising, providing technical assistance in implementation science ever since I've been at IUPUI. And as I move into these other experts here, I'll say this, that implementation science is about bridging the research to implementation gap between what we know works and making sure they happen in schools and classrooms. But that's about adult behavior. It's about what teachers are doing. It's about leadership at the building level. It's not about student behaviors. So, and I'm setting all this up for a reason, because in terms of whether or not implementation is happening with fidelity, is a remediation of what adults do. It's not a remediation of what children do. So that question is going to have to hang out there a bit in terms of the professional development, the training, and the leadership that intervenes and ensures that high quality instructional design and delivery is happening, rather than changing what children do because of retention. However, without belaboring that point, I'd like to move it back around again. And this time, Dr. Lavert, I'll give you first shot at it.
Okay.
So the question was, when we talk about these strategies, why is it that, or do you think that we have to retain children in order for those strategies to be implemented? And if we're not going to do that, what kind of professional development would you put in place to ensure that teachers are able to use the best practices for teaching reading in the early years so that children, in fact, become literate learners when it's time for them to be able to read to learn?
When I was asked to come aboard this group, I looked at the National Research Council's work on preventing reading difficulties in young children. And I found that Americans want their children to start school ready to learn. And as a principal, I noticed that this is really true. When I looked at my 4-year-olds through 3rd grade, my teachers expected the students to come to school with this mindset. With that in mind, it was very important for us to look at data. We did the MAP test, and with that MAP test, we were able to find out where our students were. And then from that, we developed our professional development, because research shows that we must look at data, and that data must inform us as to what happens in our professional development and what happens in our classroom on a day-to-day basis. So it's very important for us to look at that. And once we had our master plan, our action plan, based on that data, then we were able to pull in subgroups. And those subgroups was not only the community, parents, teachers, but we had professional development for everyone that was involved with children. Whomever touched their lives, they were a part of that. We did also progress monitoring. And progress monitoring was so important because as teachers were testing, we could see face-to-face, hands-on, what needed to happen for our children. So I'll stop right there, because I think the action plan was the driving force with data to help us provide the right kinds of professional development. And one other thing, we differentiated the professional development, because there were some teachers who said, and you probably have heard this professional development is so boring to us, so we already know these things. But if we did a survey, and then we differentiated the instruction, and that was what helped us to move our school from a D to a B in 1 year because of that. We never thought about retention. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, well, it certainly contributes to it. It does. And I appreciate that. Dr. Brown, do you have anything that you'd like to add to this?
I would just say, I certainly concur with the whole idea of consistency of practice and the implementation of whatever it is that we are going to do. Having said that, I'm a believer in Schmoker's work, and he talks about 3 very simple things that I have kind of put underneath everything that I have done, from teaching to being an administrator to doing this work that I'm doing now with teaching teachers. So we take a look at what is it that we are teaching. We take a look at what is it that the expectation is for the teaching. And then we go about looking at how we go about teaching that. And if we really wanted to come after and increase student achievement or their ability to understand literacy acquisition, we would have multiple opportunities. And I keep going back to this, multiple opportunities for reading, writing, thinking, and speaking in the classroom. And so when I think about, I too, like Dr. Lavert, we did not even think about retaining students, and I am not a proponent of that. And so I would say to you that I think, to your second part of that question, what are the supporting structures that need to be in place for that not to happen? And starting with preschool, and a high quality preschool program, going into the kindergarten program, moving through all the way through to 3rd grade. It's almost like underneath it all, that focus on literacy and literacy acquisition. And with the science of reading, the 5 areas that they're talking about, that is what we would hope to have clearly implemented in each one of the classrooms. So consistency of program and practice, the way in which we're intervening where kids are concerned, abundant amounts of purposeful reading, writing, and speaking, and then the types of development that we would do for our teachers. One last thing that I want to say, when I was looking, I too, like Dr. Burk, and I'm sure Dr. Lavert, looked at all this information that's out there. And their Education Trust did a study in 2021. And one of the things that they talked about where retention is concerned is, at least, again, no inequitable and ineffective response to unfinished learning. And what I underlined was unfinished learning. Learning occurs over time. And if you operate that learning occurs over time, then I may not get it by the time I'm in 3rd grade. Does that mean that I'm not going to get it by the time I'm in 4th grade, 5th grade, or 6th grade? And I have other work, but I'll be quiet for the sake of time for right now, that would talk about what happens with that student when we move into 4th grade if we didn't get it done by the time they're in 3rd grade.
Dr. Murphy, I just wanted to remind everyone, I know that each of these questions could spawn several dissertations. And so I just wanted to remind us, we have a lot of questions left. And so if our panelists could be very judicious so we could get as much information across to the 68 people that have joined us, I'd really appreciate it.
Well, thanks, Jarrell. I don't think we're going to be able to get to all of the questions, but
Let's get to most of them.
We'll try. And I'd like to move actually to commentary that's going on in the chat that's talking about IREAD 3, its validity and reliability and validity, and because that's really important and what it tests. And, you know, working back around, Dr. Burk, I researched what's happening in Mississippi, and it seems at some point Mississippi revised its state test to align it with the NAEP. At least that's what I've read.
Yes.
So we know that has happened. So when you look at what's happening with the IREAD and the whole validity and reliability piece, and I'm not trying to show everybody that I know a lot about statistics, but I do know that if you square any of these coefficients, then they talk about the amount of variance that is explained. So with the reliability of 0.90, it explains roughly 80% of the reason why you're getting the results you're getting. It's in between that 80% and 100% that the guessing game goes on for those students who aren't, in fact, demonstrating proficiency and the decisions that are made about them. And so when we talk about this small percentage of students, we have to remember that each year there's a certain number of students where the tests really don't accurately tell us exactly what they have mastered and what they're capable of doing. So in looking at what's going on with the retention decision, we do know that even at the end of the 2nd year, there are going to be some students who don't pass the test, and they're going to be faced with 2 years of retention. So given these factors, and you don't have to answer this question, either one of our other experts can ask, what would we do instead?
Are you asking me, Dr. Murphy?
I said either one of our experts. I don't want to just turn around and say to Dr. Burk, tell us why you didn't do something else in Mississippi, and what you did was you focused on retention. Because we've got some other things to get to. We've got to talk about what's happening across the national reading landscape. We see that people are talking about the science of reading, but phonics instruction is not new, and I know that the science of reading is more than phonics. However, we know that gains in phonics tend to wash out by the time students get to middle school. This is a very important decision that we're talking about in a child's life.
Dr.
I'm asking us as
to-
experts, what is it that we should be doing in order to make sure that we don't get to a retention decision?
I'd like to say for the record, like before we continue, that in Mississippi, we did not focus on retention. And I know you said that a couple of times, but I just want to, for the record, kind of clear the air that we did not focus on retention. We focused on prevention. And so as we continue with this conversation, I do have a couple of just follow-up questions for the those who are former administrators, and we can get to them throughout. I know that you mentioned that you didn't think about retention, so I guess a couple of questions. First, were 100% of your students proficient readers? And if they were not, then what did you do for those students who were not? And did you socially promote students? So those are questions that we can talk about later. I don't want to get off track, but I was just wondering when you don't, you know, what is the other method? Like, what do you do for if you have 100% proficiency of your kids, then that's fantastic. But if you don't, what do you do for those kids who are not proficient? And I know you mentioned, Dr. Murphy, about they'll have 2 years of retention. I didn't know that the proposed retention bill was for retention in second grade as well. Is that what you're saying?
No.
I've only seen it in third. So
what I was trying to do, Dr. Burke, and I can be wrong on this, you know, I'm like everyone else trying to get up to speed on these conversations. But at the end of that year of retention, there's a test given to students that were retained. Dr. Meyer-Brown, I think that's a fair question she just asked. What did you or others do when in fact those strategies didn't work? But I want to clarify. What I meant then is that if Hardy was retained in the third grade year, he repeats it again, and I fail the test, then I have a chance of being retained again. That would be a second year of retention.
So let me just say, I want to just, you know, I think that this conversation is extraordinarily expansive, and we want to make sure that we get as broad as we can to make sure that we get as much input as possible, because it's very easy to go down these rabbit holes. So if we can sort of just adhere to the questions so that, and we can get through as much of them. We only have about 15 minutes left, and we want to make sure that we open it up for questions. And so if we can just, again, if we could just adhere to the questions, give an opportunity for the panelists to elaborate shortly, we'll be able to really be able to make this as effective and helpful to all of the 67 participants on the call.
Sure. I guess the message to me is not to focus on retention.
No. The questions, because there are a lot of aspects of the bill and reading. And so the questions allow us to talk about the wide scope and not just retention. So I think we're on the second or third question.
No, it's okay. I'll ask the question this way. So we know
not the question, but the questions that are outlined that you worked in collaboration with Dr. Kelly. There's a number. So I just want to
let me ask one of those questions then and ask it this way. We have questions that deal with the best way to teach reading. And these ideas and these notions have been talked about for a number of years. I don't think I've seen anything new on the horizon about literacy, but I am curious because Dr. Burke did mention this issue of implementation science. So I'll phrase the question this way then. If in fact, to ensure that the things that Dr. Burke and Dr. Lavert happen, we have to do some things with schools, with teachers, and with principals. How does retention change those things that they do?
Well, I personally don't think if you are going to retain, you are not going to offer the same type of programmatic things that you did the previous year with the student. I would think that, and I think Dr. Burke the other day, you could probably answer it better than I in Mississippi. You had talked about that it doesn't look the same year 2 as it did for year 1. Having said that, I think working on intervention plans prior to you even having to make that particular decision, you know, lots of different ways of trying to come at assisting and supporting kids so you don't even have to go to that point.
Dr. Lavert?
Thank you so much. I have to go into, as an administrator, I always look at the strengths of my students. And as I said earlier, it's so important to let data run the instruction and also the implementation of the strategies in the classroom. So it's very important to find out what are the strengths of my students, focus in on those, and then pull in those areas through small group And that intervention is so important at the very
Mhm.
beginning. So if that intervention is in place and you're focusing in on their strengths, because if kids know they're not doing well, and if they're not doing well, you've got to build up that social and emotional part. That plays a major role. And to have retention hanging over their heads is not going to be the best thing. So fall into what are their strengths, and then have early intervention. Move away from whole group, differentiate the instruction so that you'll have small groups and then one-on-one interaction.
Dr. Burk, so how do student behaviors change, and do parents' behaviors change, and do teachers' behaviors change through this process?
Through the process of shifting instructional practices.
Mhm.
I suppose I could say that since we really aren't allowed to talk about retention anymore, I was curious as to whether or not retention changed student, parent, and teacher behaviors.
Oh,
But I
not
don't think we can answer that question.
yeah, I'm not a behaviorist.
Yeah, which
Yep.
actually is the most important question to ask, is what changes in the way people relate to each other in the year of retention, how students approach the learning task in the year of retention, how
Okay,
how
that's
teachers
not how,
approach the design and delivery of instruction in the year of retention. That's
okay, that
Mhm.
wasn't how you framed the question. So
Okay.
will you frame the question one more time for me?
Sure. What changes in the way students approach instruction and learning? What changes in the way teachers deliver instruction? And what changes in the way parents engage with teachers and their schools for children who've been retained?
Well, I think the change begins in kindergarten. I think that again, we're focusing a lot on what happens at the end of third grade when we're really not talking about kindergarten, first and second grade. The retention component is not intended to be a third grade teacher's responsibility. So if we're waiting until third grade to do some things, then we're too late. The adults are too late, as you mentioned before. The focus should be on identifying kids early. And again, we can begin that as early as kindergarten. So what should change with this comprehensive approach to improving reading outcomes beginning in kindergarten is a lot of the things that Dr. Lavert mentioned. I just won't go into repeating for the sake of time, but all of those best practices that she mentioned about early identification, screening, using the data to identify those students and providing them with the support, engaging parents early, parental notification, ensuring that parents are aware that their students may have a reading difficulty, and then providing them with the strategies they can use at home, and then, continuing to progress monitor and maintain that relationship and conversation with the parent. So there are things that a lot of those who are directly impacted can do, especially the state ed agency. For us, we provided an entire website for parents and other stakeholders, our standards in parent-friendly language, all of those things, the ways in which we trained our teachers, the support that we gave to our administrators to be able to monitor the progress and the shift in instructional practices for teachers. So there are a lot of behaviors that change within the scope of education and within the scope of that system. But when I said I'm not a behaviorist, that means that when you said, well, how do their behaviors change? I can't talk specifically about kids and their behaviors, but what happens with infrastructure and what happens with expectations and scheduling, all of those things to include intervention. So it's a comprehensive approach.
The reason I asked that was because there is some research that looks at the long-term effects of retention, that whether or not children experience social and emotional problems, which gets into the behaviors I was talking about.
Mm-hmm.
But Dr. Lavert, I'm going to ask you this question from the questions. It says, how do equity issues fit into this discussion?
Oh, I think equity plays a major role in it. I think I started off my presentation with the Africana framework. Who am I in this society? And how do people of my culture feel about who I am, and what are the expectations that they have for me? And so I have found that going into classrooms, teachers who really feel that all children can be successful, I have found that they are the one. Now, I'm not talking about research. I'm talking about the long-term research that I have provided as an educator and as a leader. is that teachers who have been successful are the ones who believe that all children are equal or are equal, and that they should be provided this civil rights, that they should have it. In those teachers' classrooms, those are the kids who most of the time reach 90% of proficiency in literacy. Because those kids, I can walk into a classroom and see multicultural pieces of literature. I can see projects that they've used. I'm also looking again at the National Research Council on Preventing Reading Difficulties in Young Children, and it talks about building onto their strengths, where they've come from. Just because they're coming from a low impoverished area does not mean that they can't be highly successful. Now show me those people who came from those communities that are successful. So again, equity falls in line with literacy because it just does, and all the research points to that.
So I'll ask you, Dr. Meyer-Brown, question 8 is what needs to happen to change the experiences of children, need I say it, who are retained in grade 3, so they have a different experience in grade 4 and beyond?
Well, the body of work out there on adolescent literacy and disciplinary literacy, which we're focusing on that K3 package right now. But when you take a look at what happens when a 3rd grader goes into 4th grade and the type of instruction, quality of instruction that needs to occur, again, I'm going to go back to abundant reading and writing and thinking and speaking materials in a classroom. The actual instructional strategies that we would go after, how we make our thinking visible, monitoring the progress as Dr. Lavert and Dr. Burk have talked about, making sure that they have the tools. Shanahan talks about that if I'm a math teacher or a science teacher, or a social studies teacher, that I learn reading in a completely different a different way. So we have to make sure that our teachers are very much aware of what that looks like if you're a science teacher, math teacher, etc. So anyway, I guess a focus on the success of the student, a focus on establishing the relationship with the student in order to ensure that they feel good about being in my classroom, etc. My work is out in the buildings all the time. I teach here and then I go out in the buildings because we have a clinical model. So when we see the things that I am talking about and I'm actually teaching that, then we go out and see it being replicated and or we model teach where that's concerned. And that is from kindergarten through grade 12. So I think it is taking a look at all those things that we have talked about earlier and tonight being in place in order for our students to be as successful as they can in the area of literacy.
So question 6 asks, how can we interrupt the process of potential, need I say it, retention? And it asks what proactive interventions need to happen before those decisions are made. Dr. Burk, I actually went out and looked at the retention rates from 13-14 up until now, and I don't know if I'm completely accurate, but it seems like in 13-14, the retention rate was somewhere in the neighborhood of 8 to 9%. It dropped over the next few years to 3, 4, 5, 6%. Then you had a law that changed and it's back up to 9.7%. I am curious as to what was done to interrupt the rate of retention of 8.7% in 13-14 so that it dropped to 3% in 16-17, and then a law was changed to bumped it back up to 9.7%. So what happened after 13 so that you because your test scores kept rising during that time too period?
And it's decreased from 9.7. So I'll tell you that in 13-14, when we first passed our law, as you mentioned, our retention rate was high for 3rd grade, around 9% or so. Our law, the original language was that students must pass at a level 2 or above to be retained. And we have 5 levels, and level 2 is basic. And when we began, we had our first cohort in 2014-15. It goes to everything that you all are saying here. best practices statewide were not being implemented in Mississippi. We were 50th. And I think that this conversation deserves that context. We were 50th in the nation. So if we knew how to best teach reading, we would have been doing it. We wouldn't have been 50th. So when we passed our law around all of these supports that these ladies are talking about, that included all of those things and made sure that our teachers were trained in order to change their practice. As each year passed, we had fewer students who were retained, which is the goal for students to not be retained. So as we had better prepared teachers, we also had better prepared students who were entering the next grade level. So every year, our retention rate, our retention level decreased because of all of these supports that we're putting in place, which brings us to this entire point that you're talking about. If we're doing these things, these best practices, by the time students get to third grade, again, implemented beginning in K, then you won't have to worry about retention. So the goal is prevention and intervention. So that is why our rate continued to go down, because every year we had more students who were ready, more teachers who were ready, more administrators, parents, and families. In 2019, we increased our score to passing level 3 or above, which was the pass level. Our goal is to get students to proficient by the time they get to 4th grade, right? So we increased the level, and we had the higher percentage rate in 2019 because they had to score level 3. And each year since then, excluding the COVID year, our students, our retention rate continued to fall again. So that's what happens. You raise the bar and they meet the bar. That's what's happened. And around the equity piece, our African-American students are 5th in the nation in Mississippi, the poorest, Blackest state in the nation. So I want to make sure that, and our free and reduced lunch kids are 2nd in the nation. Our Hispanic students are 5th in the nation as well, with 4th grade reading on the national assessment, on NAEP. So I don't want to lose that. In that what we're wanting to do is do what's best for all kids, and these opportunities that we're talking about are best for all kids. For Black kids, white kids, brown kids, is best for all kids. And once we ensure that the behavior has changed for the adults, meaning that we've prepared them, then they will be able to have those expectations for their students and then assist them in meeting those expectations. So
I think it's important for people to know that Dr. Burk did not pass the Mississippi law. She
I did not.
is working to ensure success with the Mississippi law.
Yeah, our governor and legislature.
You said something very profound. When we talk about high expectations and raising the bar, everyone here thinks that we're talking about children. I talk to my students about raising the bar for ourselves. And it sounds to me like what you did in Mississippi, along with the retention, was you provided supports and services so that you could raise the bar of instructional excellence from the teachers who were responsible for those students learning also. Am I correct in that?
You are very correct in that.
Thank you.
May I say something, Dr. Murphy?
You bet.
Dr. Burk, I would like to echo what you just said about professional practice and coming after best practices. In our work here with transition to teaching teachers and even with our clinical residency model, we will see the same type of things, that when we go and we actually teach, model, go out and watch, teach, model, the practices that are working, we call it miracles. We see miracles across the city of Indianapolis, because you could walk in a school and it may not be going on in one classroom, but in one of our classrooms, we are seeing students who are achieving at extremely high rates, because it goes back to who's really at the heart of the student work. The teacher is at the heart of the student work. So when we begin to start taking a look at their needs, to Dr. Lavert's point, when she was a principal and figured out what her people needed, et cetera, then we can begin to start taking a look at those best practices, the implementation and the consistency regarding that. And what we see across the city, or in your state and then across the United States are miracles, where kids, hopefully by the time they did get to third grade, would not have to be retained because we have done the prevention and intervention, et cetera, that needed to be done previously.
So
we don't retain teachers. We support them, though inadequately, because that's what this conversation is highlighting.
Mhm.
Mr. Blakely.
I want to say this is a very rich conversation. We have 7 minutes left, and I want to make sure that we open it up. We'll stay, we'll extend it about 10 more minutes to give everybody an opportunity to share. So if you have questions, please place them in the chat, and I will select a few for the consideration of the group. To kick that off, I do have a question that I like to ask. We talk, the bill was just released today from Senator Rogers, and the bill highlights that the I-read test will be given in the second grade, and if students don't pass the I-read test in the second grade, then they will have summer school after the summer between their second and third grade. Then they'll be given instruction in third grade, and if they still don't pass the test before they're retained, they'll be given an opportunity. It'll be mandatory summer school after the third grade. I know Tennessee gave tutors to students who were state-provided tutors for students in third grade who were struggling with reading. I'm interested in what are other interventions that can be provided to students and their families and their communities to ensure that retention. So if you had a magic wand, what would you ask the legislature for in terms of additional supports and supplements for students who are struggling? Again, as I mentioned, one of those supports could be tutoring, after school programs, summer schools. I'm curious to hear from everyone what we could provide to students to ensure that they're reading. And then I'll ask a few questions that are in the chat.
Mr. Blakely, you might ask people to generate that list on the chat, and then we can preserve it also.
Yes, but yeah, if people can put that in the chat, but if we can also have our esteemed panelists with their many years of experience and insight into student performance, what can we provide that student to ensure both preventative as well as while they're in third grade for those supports?
Well, I'll start. I think back in the day, we used to have this thing in the state of Indiana called primetime assistants. And every single classroom in grades K through 3 had a primetime assistant that worked in there and worked with them. In many of the schools that I go to, we do not have access to additional people and resources in our K through 3 program. So that's number one. 2 would be all of the above as far as what you said, summer school, doing those kinds of programs, a summer camp experience, etc. But I think being very intentional, going to a 30-minute intervention time that is not during that reading time would be another thing that I think would help. And then the last thing that I will say, and I keep going back to this, the abundance of reading, writing, thinking materials, and kids having access to those materials to be able to take home, to have at home, to be able to work in schools. It's almost like a gift that we would give, a gift of reading, a gift of literacy that would be available for students. That's what I see.
Dr.
Ditto. I was thinking the same thing, the uninterrupted reading block where the students are exposed to grade level instruction, and then built-in time. Scheduling is extremely important. A lot of administrators, need support in scheduling the intervention time. My daughter's school, they had what was called bulldog time, and it was 30 minutes that was scheduled 3 times per week in their regular school day for interventions or enrichment, because we have students who are on grade level or above grade level who need to make sure that they're continuing to be exposed to that type of material as well. So scheduling time, uninterrupted reading block, still exposure to grade level standards, and those things I think are very important.
Dr. Lavert.
Oh, thank you so much. And if you notice, I've talked about the Africana framework, and that's because about 81, 82, 83% of African American children in Indiana are not reading at grade level proficiency. I would like to call in all the pastors in Indianapolis and all around the state of Indiana and talk about this crisis that's going on. It's one that we have never seen since slavery time, since the Civil War period, when our people were going into churches and secretly teaching children how to read. That kind of thing has to happen today. Bring all these pastors in and talk to them about what is happening and give them a blueprint of what needs to happen. Pull in all the expert literacy specialists in schools, teachers who have data to show that they've been successful to be tutors with children. And that can be the #1 point of moving them.
Mr. Blakely, there is something here we have not touched upon that is important, and I've heard you talk about these figures before. There are some calculations that retention is going to cost this state X amount of dollars, and I am curious as to whether or not there is any information that you might share, Dr. Burke, in terms of how the state Department of Education budget has been impacted by the implementation of, I'm trying to think of the name of your program because I don't want to keep using the term retention, but there is some feeling that this is going to cost a great deal of money, and it's related to the point that I want to make that Mr. Blakely made about the Tennessee Star Project. Many years ago, when they started that, they dropped class sizes K2 to 1 to 15. So that's what they did with the money in that state budget. I am curious as to how this has impacted the Mississippi state education budget.
Well, our appropriation to implement the Literacy-Based Promotion Act is $15 million per year. That's it. It's legislatively appropriated. It comes to the Department of Education. It is not included in our student funding formula. It is specifically for the Department of Education to implement the components of the law. We use our funding for literacy coaches to support teachers on site, for our K-3 assessment system, which includes our kindergarten readiness assessment and universal screener reimbursement costs to districts for kindergarten through 3rd grade. Also for our Office of Dyslexia and Intervention Services, along with, again, interventions in English learners, and materials and supports. And we also provide additional professional development across the state. And we have one vendor, our statewide vendor for professional development is AIM. So we have AIM pathways for teachers and for administrators, all of that with $15 million to implement our law. We have not reduced class size. We've empowered our teachers to be able to teach kids how to read. In a lot of cases, I'm sure that would be welcomed. But we have teacher shortages here, just like a lot of other places. And so in some cases that was just not feasible. But we've been able to do that. So as far as impacting our state's funding formula, it hasn't done that because our money is directly tied to implementation of the law through the legislative appropriation.
You know why I appreciate your answers tonight? What you're doing is celebrating Mississippi's success.
Mm-hmm.
You're not defending retention. Those are two different things altogether. So thank you for that.
Well, we have a number of questions. Let's do this for about 3 more minutes. I see people are still here, so we'll have like 2 or 3 questions, 2 questions, and then we'll move forward. So we have a question here from, is there any current data on the number and demographic of students who are not attaining literacy? Like, what is the sort of, what does that look like in terms of the people and the students? Are there any common characteristics? And how pervasive is this issue of students not achieving literacy in the 3rd grade?
In 2023, 1 out of 5 students are lacking at the 3rd grade level foundational reading skills, according to the Department of Education. Foundational reading skills are those what we would call basic skills, being able to phonics, phonemic awareness, fluency, comprehension, vocabulary. So that was 1 in 5 when you think about that, 1 in 5. And why are they struggling? They could be struggling because of the way in which their brain processes information, the ability to focus and concentrate, environmental issues, which we brought up before, the quality of instruction in the classroom, cognitive coordination. I mean, there's lots of different things that happen as a result of that. So in order to address that, K through 3, that is the reason why the science of reading is that it is in order to address the struggling student, in order to address the foundational reading skills. That's why we have this K through 3 program.
Dr. Burke and Dr. Lavert.
I'm sorry, I was responding to someone in the chat. They had a question about class size. I'm sorry. Can you repeat the question?
Sure. I was asking
Stats.
About stats on students who were retained. I mean, or is it disproportionately BIPOC? Or is it disproportionately poor? Just curious about, how pervasive the issue is.
I think initially, especially for Mississippi, ours was, of course, disproportionately Black and poor. Since we have instituted our prevention strategies in our comprehensive approach to early literacy, then, like I mentioned, in 2018, we had less than 5% of our third graders who were retained in third grade. So we had about 95% of the kids promoted to fourth grade. I think that for us, especially having some of the poorest districts in the state and in the country, now that we have begun with our initiative in making sure that teachers and kids are ready, it has been reduced. But of course, we have in Mississippi about, I think, almost equally, about 48% of our student population is Black and about 49% or so are white. So I think it just will depend on the year. I don't have the numbers in front of me right now. Just got the question. So I don't have the numbers.
Hey, I have one thing I have to get in, Mr. Blakely. Dr. Shurick has a question that I think is really important. He has asked, as a longtime university researcher, I have a question about the Mississippi activities and results. It is difficult to understand what is causing what. From what I have heard tonight, I hear that there have been a range of activities, including retention, reading intervention, professional development, etc. Given such a range of activities, how do you know whether retention is a significant causal factor? Given all that is being done, retention could be important or not important. Do we agree with that?
I so appreciate that question, because that's what I think, I kind of started by saying, is that it's not one thing. There's no one thing. And we don't call it a miracle in Mississippi, Nancy, because everybody's been calling it a miracle for us. And I say that it shouldn't be a miracle that kids learn how to read.
And I agree with you.
Yeah, it shouldn't be a miracle. I mean, these are things that we just didn't know before. We know now. So we're doing something about it. And you're right. That's why we call it, I know Dr. Murphy was saying you were struggling to find the name for it. It's a comprehensive approach to improve reading outcomes. It's not a retention policy. It's not all of those things. It's a all hands on deck approach. And there are several things, all of which have been mentioned by Nancy and Dr. Lavert as well, that you have to do together. It's not one or the other. It's not, well, we'll train teachers this year, we'll screen kids next year, we'll do this the following year. All of these things have to go together. You have to have the right curriculum. I mean, all of those things. And then I guarantee you, if kids are ready, if teachers are ready, you won't have to worry about retention. That's not, so that's why
I agree with you.
Cultural competence is in the Indiana Legislative Code. And I stepped on you a little bit there, and I'm going to apologize.
Okay.
Do you know whether or not Mississippi has that kind of language in its legislative code that teachers should achieve cultural competence and that there should be strategies in place and services to ensure that teachers chief cultural competence? And even if it isn't, is it something that that's a part of this reading initiative?
Now, remember, we're in the state where they had a lot going on around, I can't even remember what it was.
Race theory.
Critical race theory, and that was nowhere to actually be found. And we had an entire legislative bill about it, and we don't, it's nowhere to be found. So,
Okay,
in K-12. So, no. Short
that's an
answer.
honest answer.
So I want to say this. We could be here all night, and I want to give all of the 60 people who thought it not robbery to join us today. I want to thank our panelists. I want to thank our moderator. I want to thank our participants for such a rigorous and robust debate about something that's really important for Hoosier community's future and for our young people's future. And so I want to give a plug for the organization that put this together, the Indiana Educational Equity Coalition. We have rich conversations on a regular basis about issues that impact the Hoosier public education school system. So I am going to place my email address in the chat. And if you are interested in learning more about the coalition, please send me an email so that we can forward you opportunities to be engaged. This is one of many activities that our coalition puts together so that we are informed, that we are engaged. And so I want to thank everybody. This was wonderful. I learned a lot. I think a lot of people learned a lot. And so please, if you have any questions, please copy my email address and send me an email, express interest, and we will make sure that you get on the email list and that you are invited to our meetings. There's an old African saying that if you want to go fast, you go by yourself, but if you want to go far, you go with others. And so today's meeting, today's initiative was precisely in the spirit of that African proverb. And I want to thank Dr. Murphy, Dr. Lavert, Dr. Burke, and Ms. Meyer-Brown for their participation. So
Thank you.
Please send me an email. I hope to have an inbox full of emails with people who are interested in continuing work with this coalition to make the promise of an excellent education real for all of the students that we serve in Indiana.
Dr. Burke, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Dr.
you.
Lavert, thank you. Dr. Brown. Audience, thank you. And as we check out, I just learned how to do this. Does everybody know how to put a clapped hand in these emojis from your, let's give everybody a clapped hand here. Can we do that? That's good. There we go. There we go. Okay. Thank you all very much.
All right, we'll leave it open so that people can copy the email address. It's really important. If you're interested in engaging, please send me an email because we need everybody at the table as we are crafting policies and attempting to influence public policy here in the Hoosier State. I know it's getting up. People are leaving. I'm going to just copy this and make sure that it's continued so people can do that.
One of the things, Mr. Blakely, that you might want to put in the chat is that Marion is getting ready to offer a master's degree in the science of reading starting this summer. I don't know if everybody's aware of that or not, but if they wanted to do and participate in some professional development experiences, Karen Betts is our person that's going to be kind of spearheading that, and that will begin this summer.
Wow. Fantastic.
To our out-of-town guest, you acquitted yourself well. To our experts here, you certainly have risen to the occasion. And to everyone who is tuned in, this is just the beginning. We're going to have other conversations about decisions that are going to be made for the children in the schools of the state of Indiana. So thank you all very much.
I don't have community scars, Dr. Murphy. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Murphy and Mr. Blakely. Dr. Kelly, thank you very much. It was so nice meeting you, Dr. Lavert and Dr. Burke. I have to go. My class is being taught down the hallway. And so I've got a substitute. Here we go. Substitute in there with the graduate students. But I said I was going to get off of here and run down there and finish teaching.
Have a good night.
Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. We are going to close this chat. Everybody have a really good night, and I look forward to hearing from folks to stay engaged in this coalition. Thank you, and have a great night.
Thank you for the opportunity. Appreciate it.
It's our pleasure. You all were rock stars.